Okay, all right. I'm on Seymour Fair. We're here for another video. We're gonna do from Lenin to Putin, the continuity of the Soviet power. So it's a paper by Vladimir Moss, and I'm not sure when it was written, but it's about 15 pages long, and we'll get to it. So. It says most Orthodox Christians agree that the state founded by Lenin in October 1917 was the most evil in human history to this date. A regime that was openly and officially anti-Christian overthrew the greatest Christian empire in history and proceeded to try and destroy everything and everyone in any way retained any kind of loyalty or similarity to the pre-revolutionary past. Recalling the French Revolution, but much more radical, the Russian Revolution killed perhaps 100 million of its own Soviet citizens and many millions more in other countries, blanketing as its greatest extent the whole landmass from Berlin to Vladivostok in a nightmare of militant atheism that caused those who were under threat of being returned to commit suicide in droves. Probably shouldn't have said that. However, there is much less agreement on whether the present day Vladimir Putin is a continuation and resurrection of the Leninist regime or not. This is an important question. For in 1918, at her last genuine local council, the Russian Orthodox Church, led by martyr patriarch Tikhon, anathematized the Soviet regime, for forbidding her members to have nothing whatsoever to do with these, quote, outcasts of humanity. Only against the regimes of Julian the Apostate and Napoleon has the Orthodox Church ever issued similar decrees. This, quote, decree of irreconcilability has never been rescinded. So, if the Putinist regime is truly the successor of the Leninist one, our attitude is to it must be similar, irreconcilable. The question, therefore, is the present day Putinist regime Leninist in essence? In order to answer this question, we have to separate what is essential to Leninism from what is not, and ask whether Putin retains that essence, even if in many other ways, his regime may be very different. Our thesis is that the essence of Leninism is loyalty to Lenin himself, and that while many things have changed since 1917, the devotion to Lenin and a refusal to condemn him or his reincarnation Stalin remains the bond binding together of all epochs of the Soviet and post-Soviet history to the present day, as witnessed above by all the continuing worship of his body in the mausoleum on the Red Square. Lenin's teachings are no longer believed in. His party no longer holds power. Even his vitriolic hatred of God and Christianity is gone. But he himself remains alive and well in the hearts of the majority of the Russian people. And it is this psychological and spiritual bond, more powerful than any ideological sympathy or antipathy, that makes Leninism a continuing force. Moreover, it is a force that any succeeding leader like Putin can tap into, so long as the idol still remains in place. And why does the idol still remain in place? Because neither in 1991 nor at any other time has there been a thoroughgoing repentance for the sins of the Soviet past or former renunciation of Lenin. Let us briefly summarize the main stages of Russian history since 1917. 1. 1917 to 1921. The first 3.5 years of Soviet power present us with all the familiar signs of Leninism: theft, murder, blasphemy, sexual depravity, civil and international war, all on an industrial, unprecedented scale. Before the revolution, revolutionaries like Stalin robbed banks and post offices. After After the revolution, they robbed whole classes and provinces and then and murdered the inhabitants. Quote, war communism established the principle that nothing whatsoever is holy, and especially not the Holy Church. However, in March 1921, the 13th Party Congress established the, quote, factionalism, i.e., dissent is forbidden, and that one thing, after all, is holy, the will of the party, as expressed in the will of Lenin. This decree on the, quote, dictatorship of the party, which was in fact dictatorship of Lenin, formalized the essence of Leninism. 2. 1921 through 1928. Having established the essence of the system as being his own infallibility as the vicar of history, Lenin could afford to relax on others, less important principles of communism. Thus, the new economic policy, the reintroduction of a limited degree of capitalism and private property, and a certain let up in religious persecution was allowed. However, the death of Lenin in January 1924 raised the question how to preserve the essence of Leninism without Lenin himself. The answer was the preservation of the body of Lenin and the institution of its worship. Now, even the leaders might change and the policies might change. Lenin himself remained unchanged and eternal. 3. 1928 through 1939. Nevertheless, the need for a single infallible will remained, and Lenin could no longer express that will from beyond the grave, so a successor, the new Lenin, has to be found. After much political infighting, Stalin won the battle for recognition as the new Lenin and proceeded to reestablish the absolute unity of will by eliminating all his opponents, actual and potential. This involved, among other things, killing 14 million Ukrainians by famine, driving the true church into the underground, and eliminating all the old Bolsheviks who remembered that Stalin was not Lenin. 4. 1939 to 45. In Germany, however, there emerged another infallible whom Stalin could not destroy, and so searching as ever for new means of consolidating his rule, Stalin decided to borrow certain things from H, just as H, by his own admission, borrowed certain things from Stalin. The internationalism of world revolution was now dropped, together with its main advocate, Trotsky, and in its place came, quote, socialism in one country. Instead of denigrating the whole of Russian history, certain aspects of it, especially despotism of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, were recalled with pride. Patriotism ceased to be a dirty word, and the official church was now used as a vehicle of stirring it up in believers. Only its object now was not Orthodox Russia, but anti Orthodox Russia, and these new emotional resources proved to be invaluable when H invaded Russia. With their aid, the unnatural situation of two infallible popes was corrected by Stalin's victory over the anti-pope. So that in this paper he's comparing, Mr. Mustache with Stalin as being pope and anti-pope because they both seen themselves infallible over the world. So, 5, 1945 through 1953. Now, however Stalin reverted to type. The nationalist deviation, permissible during the struggle against Hitler, was corrected as the revolution against it recovered its internationalist direction. At the same time, the newest member of the Leninist Club, Mao's China, was made to feel in no uncertain terms it was a very junior part into Soviet Russia. The main external enemy, again, was Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Orthodoxy was again repressed unless it was expressed in support of infallible leader, and the number of those in the camp surpassed even this pre-war peak. 6. 1953 to 1991. With the death of Stalin, the struggle to find the new Lenin began again. In 1956, one of the contenders, Khrushchev, exposed the sins of Stalin as a secret meeting in the party. However, this was like a Roman cardinal saying the Pope was not infallible. Khrushchev was found insufferably Leninist and fell from power. However, none of his successors, Berdyaev, Andropov, Chernokov, and Gorba- Gorbachev, were able to plug the credibility gap that now opened up as the inferiority of the Soviet system to its capitalist rival became more and more evident. The desperate attempt of Gorbiev, Gorbachev, I guess that's how you say it, to import some Western flexibility and freedom into the social and economic life led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the breakup of the Union itself. 7. 1991 through 2000. The 1990s, the period of Yeltsin's presidency, represented the moment when it took to many as if Leninism were finally doomed. Something resembling real democracy, and the free market was introduced. But the market reforms were so radical and sudden, introduced by Chicago school advocates of, quote, shock therapy as the only method of changing communism into capitalism, that millions found themselves plunged into poverty, while a few clever entrepreneurs with links to the government, the so called oligarchs, made vast fortunes through rigged privatizations. The result, capitalism was discredited in the minds of the people. Again, when the supposed democratic Yeltsin, determined to push through his reforms, come what may, defied the sentence of the Constitutional Court and sent the tanks against the elected delegates of the Duma. The result was the discrediting also of democracy in the minds of people. But still more serious was the, quote, acquitting of the Communist Party in a quasi trial in 1992. The failure of the true Russian Church to oust the Sovietized Moscow Patriarchate, whose bishops remain now, as in Soviet times, as KGB agents, and above all, the failure to remove Lenin from the mausoleum, so the essence of Leninism remains intact. Yeah, so. Okay, so we're going to continue on. When Putin came to power on the first day of the new millennium, he soon demonstrated his political sympathies. The fall of the Soviet Union, he said, had been, quote, a geopolitical tragedy. Such perhaps was only to be expected of a former KGB agent who had been appointed head of the KGB FSB only a few years before. Unfortunately, however, most of the Western world, and even the Orthodox world, chose to ignore these facts. They were determined to believe that the Putin regime represented not a KGB stage coup and the beginning of a gradual return to Sovietism, but a continuation of the Yeltsin regime, albeit a slower pace of political and economic change. Of course, the presence of continuity with Yeltsin regime was preserved. Yeltsin himself handed over power to the unelected Putin, and multi-party elections to the Duma remained in existence. However, in the course of time, the largest party, including the communists, turned out to be suspiciously close to Putin in their views. Failing to form a real opposition, his own election was manifestly rigged, and the system changed to enable him to rule virtually uninterruptedly until the present, and the last vestiges of democracy at the local provincial level were eliminated. Moreover, Putin evolved a doctrine of, quote, sovereign democracy, which meant in effect that Russia was a, quote, democracy, but with himself as sovereign. Thus, as Roger Boutel writes, quote, in place to the tired and rotten value system of communism, the prime value objective of the modern Russian state is quite simply pro bono Putino. But this too is essentially communist. For in the last analysis, Lenin and Stalin did not rule for the benefit of anyone other than themselves. A deeper and more sinister continuity was that the stripping of Russia's natural resources continued only by a different clan of bandits. When considering that the Putinist mafia states pillaging of the nationalist assets, we must remember that Leninism and banditism have existed in the closest symbiosis ever since Stalin robbed the Tbilisi Bank and the Sochi post office to provide Lenin with funds for the revolutionary terror in the 1900s. With funds for revolutionary terror in the 1900s, the victims in the 1920s were the nobles and the industrialists and the church. In the 1930s, the peasants, the generals, and the old Bolsheviks. In the 1940s, the Germans, the Crimean Tartars, and other conquered peoples. And in the 1990s, all small time investors and account holders. In the 2000s, it was the oligarchs, turned in true Leninist style. Putin experiated the expiators. However, far from Putin, quote, cleaning up the country after the oligarchs' excesses in the 1990s, which is what he claimed to be doing, he simply replaced one clan of bandits with another, sharing out the proceeds among those who recognize his power as the chief thief. The transfer here was effective, not by Yeltsin, but by the Jewish oligarch Berezovsky, who hoped that Putin would rule to the advantage of him and his clan. Since Yeltsin had also been involved in the pillaging, Putin's first act as president was to give immunity from persecution to Yeltsin and his family. However, Berezovsky was deceived. Putin put his own St. Petersburg mafia in charge and forced Berezovsky to flee into England exile until a recent mysterious quote, he offed himself. Others who pretended some measure of political and economic dependence, such as Kordyovsky, were imprisoned or on trumped up charges, or driven out of the country. Now Putin was free to become the godfather of all godfathers. He and his cronies made fabulous gains, most of which were spirited abroad. And Putin himself, according to the Sunday Times, became the world's richest man. Taking advantage of high prices for oil and gas, Putin was able to distribute some of the profits to the middle classes, keeping them happy for a time being. There were murmurings from them in 2012, but these were comparatively easily suppressed. Moreover, he increased the numbers of bureaucrats, 40% of whom were KGB, and fattened their pay packets. In this way, he guaranteed their support, a tactic he borrowed from the Bolsheviks in the Civil War period. But the poor remained poor, and the gap between the richest and the poorest became the highest in the world, except in some Caribbean islands. State institutions and services such as the education and health were starved of funds. The only notable exceptions were the armed forces and the security services, which received vast increases reminiscent of H rearming in the 1930s. So he took some National Socialist tactics, clearly. Like all Soviet leaders, Putin shows a marked antipathy uh, to the West and steadfast conviction that his country is morally superior to the West. The problem is the extreme moral degradation of contemporary Russian society is plain for all to see. So what they do is he'll demonize the West and say it's the West's fault or it's the Jays or it's the everybody else but them, you know. So the problem is extreme moral degradation in contemporary Russian society is plain for all to see. The most obvious explanation for this is the many decades of Soviet rule, when religious faith was persecuted and morality was equated with what was beneficial for the revolution. However, Putin deals with this problem by putting the blame exclusively on Yeltsin's period, because that was the most westernizing. Before Yeltsin, he argued in 2012 in a speech in the Federal Assembly, Soviet society had been distinguished by charity, compassion, and sympathy. Quote, today, Russian society is an obvious deficit in spiritual bonds, a deficit in everything that made us all times stronger, more powerful, in which we always pride ourselves. This is absolutely insane. So he's saying that the Soviet society had been distinguished by charity, compassion, and sympathy as they killed 100 million Orthodox Christians or close to it. And, he's talking about that there was a stronger, more powerful, spiritual bond during this massacre. So, wow. In which we are always proud of ourselves. This is such a phenomenon, such as charity, compassion, and sympathy. The situation that has been created is a consequence of the fact that some 15 to 20 years ago, the ideological stamps of the former epoch were rejected. Unfortunately, at that time, many moral signposts were lost. The following year, however, at the Valdai Forum, at which many Westerners were present, Putin felt able to boast that in spite of the, quote, obvious deficit in spiritual bonds, Russia under his rule preserved, quote, Christian values better than the West. Quote, we see that many Euro-Atlantic countries have de facto gone the path of the rejection of Christian values. Moral principles are being denied. What could be a greater witness of the moral crisis of the human socium than the loss of the capacity of self-reproduction? But today, practically all developed countries can no longer reproduce themselves without the values laid down in Christianity and other world religions. Without the norms of ethnic and morality formed in the course of millennia, people inevitably lose their human dignity, and we consider it natural and right to defend these values. As it's funny he's saying that there's a degradation of values, as we're, there's a propaganda machine that's clearly, um, the same Bolshevik, uh, Western allies or whatever, that were around at the time of Lenin and Stalin. There's a continuity there as well that are pushing, the degradation and divisive politics to the West and all these types of things. I mean, they've communism has rotted America from the inside out. So he's actively doing this and saying, well, look at them, that they have no Christian values. But what are his values? Are they really Christian? The strange thing about this extraordinary hypocritical statement is that Putin pretends to be entirely unconscious of the fact that, with regard to the, quote, Christian value that he specifically cites here, quote, self reproduction, Russia performs worse than any Western country. Thus, even after taking migration into the account, the 28 countries of the European Union have a natural growth in population that is twice as high as Russia's. And if he is referring not to the balance between the birth rate and the death rate, but to homosexuality as a factor that by definition inhibits reproduction, then the situation is a little better in Russia than in West. For in spite of Putin's much valued ban on pro-gay propaganda to minors, the vice remains legal among adults. Thus, a marriage between two women was recently registered officially in Moscow. Homosexuality even flourishes in places which it should have been banished first of all. Thus, among the 300 bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate, 50, according to one estimate, Father Andrei uh, Kuriev, and 250, according to another, Father Gleb Yakunin, are homosexuals. In other spheres relating to morality, Russia, according to the United Nations statistics, occupies the following position in world league tables. Quote, 1 in offing yourself as an adult, child, or adolescent. Okay, so we have another one here. Wait, so they're first in that. First in numbers of children born out of wedlock. First in children abandoned by parents. First in absolute decline in population. First in consumption of spirits and spirit-based drinks. 1 in consumption of strong alcohol. 1 in tobacco sales. 1 in death from alcohol and tobacco. 1 in deaths from cardiovascular disease. Number 2 in fake medicine sales. And number 1 in heroin consumption. 21 in world production. Okay, so wow. These statistics show that Russia, far from leading the world in the practice of Christian values, is perhaps the most corrupt country of all. As regards general criminality, theft, corruption, and murder, including abortion, Russia is very near the top of the league. And this is not least because the government itself is taking the lead in these activities, making Russia into a mafia state run by and for a small clique of fantastically rich criminals. Thus, the general picture of one is one of extreme moral degradation. Moral degradation within the country is matched by cruelty and hatred to those outside. The most important of Putin's decisions in the early years was his reinstating of the war against the Chechens, which he carried out with extreme brutality. The KGB provided the justification for the war by blowing up apartment block in Ryazan, killing 400 people, and blaming the atrocity on the Chechen terrorists. Whistleblowers and truth seekers are found who expose these crimes, such as the journalist Anna Polikovskaya or the former Litvinenko. They were simply murdered, Litvinenko, through a mini atomic bomb. Wow. The KGB existed to carry out these sentences to justify and cover up Putin's decisions and to share in the proceeds. Having posed a pro-Russian puppet government on the Chechens, Putin now turned to the other, quote, troublemakers, but not before declaring at Munich in 2007 that Russia reserved the right of the first strike in a nuclear war, a right that not even the Soviet Union had even claimed. Although the world appeared not to notice, Russia appeared not to simply to have recommended the Cold War, but to be preparing for a hot thermonuclear one. Then in the next year, Russia invaded Georgia, pushing them from their, quote, Orange Revolution in favor of the West and annexing Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Quote, moreover, writes Armando Marquis Gaudes, quote, the Russian administration signaled it was set for a sort of repeat performance. Toward the end of December 2008, the Kremlin announced an unexpected large-scale reconstructing of its armed forces. Although a change in the military doctrine, all this, as was later explained by the Russian Minister of Defense, was engaged so that her armed forces would be ready to fight three fronts simultaneously in local and regional conflicts, such as at Georgia. He thereafter defended the post-Soviet space as the preferred location for such interventions, which he envisioned as coming to pass during the year of 2009. It actually came to pass in the year 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the military intervention in the Donbass. Putin's actions here resemble those of Milosevic, the former Yugoslavia. In both cases, the strategy was to rebuild a communist empire state by artificially stirring up ethnic conflicts in neighboring states that have separated from the empire and then sending in the troops on the pretense of, quote, liberating co-ethnics Russians and Serbs from their supposedly, quote, fascist oppressors, West Ukrainian Banderites, and the Croats. Wow. However, the most striking parallel to Putin's actions in the Ukraine comes from the truly fascist state of, I'll just say it, whatever, they take me down, Nazi Germany in 1938, when Hitler carved out Czechoslovakia on the pretense of rescuing the Sudeten Germans from their Czech oppressors. Nor is this the only similarity between the regimes of Putin and Hitler. These similarities are the result not only of the general close similarity between the twin totalitarianisms of communism and fascism, but also of the fact that Russia never underwent a, quote, decommunization program in 1991 comparable to that undergone by Germany in 1945. Indeed, a good way of seeing how little modern Russia has been truly decommunized is to imagine that in Germany in 1945 had not been thoroughly crushed militarily and, quote, denazified politically and culturally, but has been allowed to develop in ways that Russia has been allowed to develop under Putin. According to this imagined scenario, Germany was allowed to retain almost all its Nazi cadres with no trial or any Nazi war criminals. Some changes have been made in political systems, but the SS remained in place, and the Nazi Party continued in existence and continued to do well in the polls with many members in Reichstag. The party seemed to be on excellent terms with the president, and its leaders was given awards by the official church, which remained pro-Nazi and was headed by members of the SS. The army had been much reduced, but vast sums were being poured into its modernization, including the latest weapons of mass destruction, and the swastika had been restored. One neighboring country had been invaded by Wehrmacht, and another had been undermined by Nazi propaganda and undercover agents, together with large shipments of tanks and artillery. The Jews were again being reviled in public, and the West was being threatened with nuclear annihilation on television. Hitler's Berlin bunker, over which a mausoleum had been constructed, was greatly honored, and his military victories were being feted and his political repressions and murders justified. A cold personality of a new leader was being encouraged. A modernized version of Hitler Youth movement had been started, and generally pure Aryan boys and girls were being encouraged to get together and bear children for the Reich. One female member of the parliament even suggested, quote, material from the genius leader should be sent to women around the country so that they should be able to give birth to his genius offspring. Journalists and political opponents were being killed, and anti-Nazi churches were being deprived of their property on various quasi-legal excuses. A close relationship existed between the government and organized crime. Corruption was at the time record levels, and Germany was at the top of the list of various indices and social degradation. Abortion, drug dealing, uh, child mortality, offing yourself, etc., issued by the United Nations. If this were happening in Germany today, we can imagine the uproar, the calls from all sides to uproot the neo-Nazi menace. But although something very similar is happening in Russia today, in reality and not in imagination, the response of the world has been much more muted. There are few who see this as a resurrection of Leninism and Sovietism. All this is clearly what is happening, in fact. Although the Soviet victory was over fascism in 1945 is now celebrated as the greatest festival on the Russian Federation's calendar, and any criticism of the Red Army, extremely cruel conquest of the Third Reich, is now a criminal offense. And the most striking aspect of today's Russia is what can only be called fascism. Of course, Putin accuses the Ukrainian regime of being fascist, but so often the totalitarian regimes, whether fascist or communist, the truth is the exact opposite of the propaganda. Russia is now what accuses Ukraine of being, a fascist state in all but name. Moreover, its fascism tingled with the most abominable blasphemy. KGB patriarch Kirill Gudiev, codename Mikolov, declared in 2009 that the atheist Red Army's victory in 1945 was not only holy, but also that Stalin had thereby redeemed all the sins of the 1930s and even, quote, trampled down death by death. One of the clearest proofs that Russia is returning to Sovietism in the use of the is the use of the Soviet symbolism. Already in the early years of Putin's reign, the Red Army was given back its red flags and Soviet anthem, the music, if not the words, and, quote, ecclesiastical Stalinism in the form of icons and hagiographies of the great leader became commonplace. More recently, and especially since the invasion of Crimea, statues of Lenin have been uh, re-erected, rather, and the hammer and the sickle and other communist symbols again flutters in many places, even in conjunction with the cross of Christ. The contrast with Ukraine is striking. From 1991 until 2014, in spite of abortive attempts to free itself from its Soviet past, such as the 2004 Orange Revolution, Ukraine remains in the grip of the Russian KGB, which did not hesitate to use force in order to impose its will on its satellite and retain its control over Ukraine's army and secret services. However, when the last Putin-style bandit president, Yanukovych, that's what he said, was ejected by the popular rebellion of the Euro Maiden in February 2014, a remarkable transformation began to take place. Statues of Lenin were being torn down all over the country. Genuine elections were being held, and most recently and significantly, significantly, the president Okay, I guess we're back. I fell out for a moment, so all right. Apologize about that. Okay, so Sovietism is in the use of Soviet symbolism. Hold on one second. Let me get some water. One second. Okay, all right. Yeah, that's definitely what happened. They jammed the transmission, man. Okay, so okay, so here we are. Sovietism is the use of Soviet symbolism already in the early years of Putin's reign. The Red Army was given back its red flag and Soviet anthem. The music, if not the words, and quote, ecclesiastical Stalinism in the former icons of Stalin and hagiographies of the great leader became commonplace. More especially since the invasion of the Crimea, the statues of Lenin had been re erected, and the hammer and the sickle and the other communist symbols again flutters in many places, even in conjunction with the cross of Christ. I know I read this, but I figure, it's a pretty important thing to know. So the contrast with Ukraine is striking. From 1991 until 2014, in spite of the abortive attempts to free itself from its Soviet past, such as the 2004, quote, Orange Revolution, Ukraine remained in the grip of the Russian KGB, which did not hesitate to use force in order to impose its will on its satellite and retain its control over Ukraine's army and secret services. However, when the last Putin style bandit, President Yanukovych, was elected by a popular rebellion of the Euromaidan in February 2014, a remarkable transformation began to take place. Statues of Lenin were torn down all over the country. Genuine elections were held, and most recently and significantly, President Poroshenko and the Ukrainian parliament have passed legislation where its aim is the final decommunization of Ukraine. The legislation consists of four bills. The first acknowledged a long list of movements and organizations that fought for Ukrainian independence of the Soviets. The quote taboo on these organizations is now lifted, and their deeds can be openly and freely analyzed by historians and other without fear of reprisals. The second bill opens the secret police archives, thereby making possible impartial historiography and the persecution of communist criminals. The third bill says that the Second World War began in 1939 with Molotov Ribbentrop Pact, rather than in 1941 with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The fourth bill prohibits the quote propaganda of the communist or National Socialist totalitarian regimes in Ukraine. Quote, in addition, writes Alexander Moitiel, quote, to advocating the removal of the communist monuments and public symbols and the renaming of streets and cities, the bill attempts to distinguish between the materials that promote communist and Nazi regimes, which is prohibited, and those that express pro regime views, which would not be deemed illegal. The assumption underlying the four bills is that since communism and Nazism were equally evil ideologies, condemnation of one necessary entails both logically and morally condemnation of the other. If denazification is crucial, so too is decommunization. Of course, legislation is one thing, and its full implementation is another. implementation is not. It must be admitted that Ukraine is only just beginning to free itself from the corruption of its Soviet past. In particular, there is evidence that the Russian KGB still has strong influence in Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, these bills are precisely the kind of legislation that provides proof that a country is serious about decommunization itself. Russia, in stark contrast with Ukraine, has not only not started its decommunization herself in this way, she is actively, quote, recommunizing herself. And it's precisely that this fact that a deep psychological level motivates many Russians, and by no means at all to hate Ukraine as Cain hated Abel. As Sergei Yakel Yokachich writes, the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014 threatens the ideology of Putin's regime. It questions Russia's identity. It challenges Russia's plan to restore its influence in the region, and it also shows that the uh, Putinite regime can be destroyed by a popular revolution. No wonder Russia has recalled its ambassador from Ukraine and refuses to recognize the country's new government. There are some aspects of Soviet history that have not yet repeated themselves during Putin's reign. One of these is the large-scale imprisoning the dissidents in the Gulag, although large extra prisons are being built. Another is the open prosecution of the Orthodox faith, although true Orthodox, that is, anti-Soviet Christians, get no favor from this government. However, the fact that not all the aspects of Leninism have been restored in small comfort when so much is being restored, just as cancer remains dangerous and life-threatening, even when only a few cancerous cells remain in the body. So the present incipient recommunization can quickly develop into something that threatens the whole world. As Metropolitan Anastasi, first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad, wrote in 1938, quote, there is nothing more dangerous than if Russia were to want to assimilate anything from the sad inheritance left by the degenerate Bolshevism. Everything that is corrupting atheist hand has touched threatens to infect us again with the old leprosy. The Metropolitan's words have proved to be prophetic. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, there were many who rejoiced in the supposed fall of Bolshevism, but there was no root and branch purge, and so communism has revived. Above all, Lenin still lies in the mausoleum, enjoying that immunity from persecution and corruption that only Egyptian pharaohs and Roman popes can enjoy. Before the revolution, St. John of Kronstadt said that Russia without the Tsar would be a, quote, stinking corpse. The corpse continues to stink, and nobody in power is trying to take it out of the room. Okay, so that was the end of the episode. Shout out to the donuts, as always. And, yeah, I appreciate you guys for stopping by. Exactly. Um, yeah. Thank you. Appreciate you, brother. Yeah, always, man. Okay, so that was it. I got something set up soon, so yeah, I'm gonna do a follow up on this later, guys.